Welcome in to the first episode of The Install with Greg Cosell of NFL Films. I am not Greg Cosell of NFL Films. That is the man who sits across the Zoom screen from me. I'm Buck Rising of 104.5 The Zone. We are incredibly excited to be bringing this podcast to you, and we can't wait to get started today with our AFC South preview. What's going on, Greg?
Buck, it's good to be with you. You're looking sharp there. I like the little thing behind you there. You know, the bobble. Is that a bobblehead?
That is a Coach Dave McGinnis bobblehead with a do-rag. I'm not sure who's responsible for the do-rag.
I'm feeling very left out. I don't have a bobblehead, Buck.
Well, listen, I can do that for you next time, Greg. We can see how many we can start popping up behind me. We'll see if you recognize.
All right. That's your assignment for next week.
The assignment for this week, however, is the AFC South. Now, Greg, I guess for people, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the conversation, there are so many platforms that you are talking about football on, breaking down film for people to help them understand what it is that they're watching on Sundays, Mondays, and Thursdays. Why did you want to do this podcast to kind of further that insight and that deep dive for this audience here in Nashville?
I have no idea. No, just kidding. I really like the podcast format because you can be a lot looser. You can talk a little more. You can get into more things. I've done, as you know, radio for years and years, and radio is a very tight format where you can only speak, a couple of sentences and then you have to move on. So, I just think the podcast format allows for more explanation. You can get into more detail, a little more depth. And I think it also brings out personalities, because when you are talking about tactical X and O football, the last thing we want it to be is we don't want it to feel like people who are watching this, and hopefully it will be a lot. I don't want them to feel like they're in a constitutional law seminar back in college.
Yeah.
So I think you can get into a little more of your personality, have a little more fun, and yet still really get into the X's and O's of the game.
Well, I failed constitutional law for what it's worth. That's what I said in front of the microphone. I mean, I wish I was lying about that, Craig, but that didn't. That's why I'm in sports media, because I wasn't smart enough to go to law school,
Buck. Because I majored in American history and political science, but somehow that never happened. And here I am.
Here we are, ready to bring you this first episode and start with the AFC South. So why don't we go with the hometown team, the local professional football team, the Tennessee Titans. It's largely the same core of players that's returning, but some pretty substantial, pretty key absences that the Tennessee Titans will be moving into this season with, Greg, with Julio Jones added to the roster, but losing probably the most, and maybe you'll be able to push back on this, because as far as I'm concerned, with what the Titans want to do on the offensive side of the football, I don't think that there was any piece outside of the players executing that was more critical to the success of this team than offensive coordinator Arthur Smith last year, now head coach of the Atlanta Falcons. When you look at the way that this roster has been shaped with the addition at the wide receiver position, Josh Reynolds as well being the replacement in the slot, and I think he's going to see a lot of action in the slot based on how Sean McVay liked to use him. What is your evaluation of this Titans team and how things may look differently heading into 2021?
It's a great question, Buck, and it's obviously a question I've been asked a lot and thought about a lot, and I think it's a challenge. I think it's easy to say they're really talented, and they are really talented on offense, and you'd rather be really talented than not really talented. But I think the structure, the philosophy, the approach, that's going to be a real challenge for Todd Downing, because this is a team that clearly the foundation has been Derrick Henry over the last 2 years. He's led the NFL in carries in each of the last 2 years. He's had far and away the most first down rushes of any back. And now you have a plethora of weapons on the perimeter. You have Julio Jones, who I wouldn't say he's lost a step. He may not be quite as vertically explosive, but he's still pretty much a dude. So you have him. You've got A.J. Brown, who's really good, really strong and physical. He's not as big as someone like DK Metcalf, but the physicality element is very similar. So you've got two big-time wideouts, both very good run after catch. Both very good running in-breaking routes, by the way, which is really important in this offense because with all the play action you can do with Derrick Henry, you get those linebackers, those second-level defenders to attack the line of scrimmage, and you create that gap between the linebacker level and the safety level, so those in-breakers behind the linebacker level are there. And both Julio and A.J. Brown are really, really good running those in-breakers with the run after catch ability that both possess. So the weapons are in place. I'm fascinated to see sort of what the philosophy, the identity, the structure of this offense is.
And I think that's the biggest question out of any of them, right? How much Todd Downing keeps from a schematic standpoint that seemed to succeed so well with Arthur Smith and what they were doing, the play action game predicated off the outside zone runs, Derrick Henry and Ryan Tannehill, not really overwhelming anybody, but being, I mean, Greg, I think the best way that I could describe Tannehill is ruthlessly efficient with the way that he operates this offense. And I wonder, given that we are in still the offseason, about 2 weeks before teams report back for training camp, or at least the Titans will report back for training camp in 2 weeks. ESPN has been doing this positional preview, these top 10 lists of 11 positions on ESPN.com. Ryan Tannehill, it's been the subject of much consternation down here, left off the top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL. Now, I'm certain that somebody like you does not care for.
I do not.
Yeah, that's what I tell people on the radio show, Greg, and then we talk about the damn list. It drives me crazy.
Right.
But this
I think I saw that list when it came out
ourselves.
last week, and I can't remember what the order was, but I don't really care about that. You know, and that's but the question you're essentially asking is a legitimate one because Ryan Tannehill is in an offense whose foundation is the run game, and he works off that. Now, he's had good success on third down, and I've watched his third down throws, and he's done a really nice job because obviously you're not working with the play action pass game. The defense has the tactical advantage on third down, particularly third and long, and I think Tannehill's done a very, very good job. But I'm sure there's a sense that and what I'm about to say, by the way, is not a negative term because everyone is, but I think there's a sense that he's a system quarterback. Now, I just want to say this. Every quarterback is a system quarterback because that's the way it's taught.
Right.
There's no coach who rolls the ball out and says, let's see what we can do today and let's run around and see what happens. Every quarterback is taught a system. Now, I think people still have a sense of what a system quarterback means in that he needs all the pieces in place to be effective. That's a hard question to answer with Ryan Tannehill. This is the offense in which he's in. He's been very efficient, very effective within the context of this offense. The weapons are in place. We'll see. You know, here's something to keep in mind. Arthur Smith's background is probably more along the lines of the Kyle Shanahans of the world, where you run the ball a lot out of base personnel. You use a fullback. We've seen that the Titans have both used Kerry Blasingame and then Michael Pruitt when I guess he's not there anymore, but Michael Pruitt, you know, was used as a fullback very often. So it was a lot of two-back sets, and that has an impact on the defense, and it has a major impact on the efficiency of your play-action pass game. Todd Downing's background is a little different. Todd Downing kind of came into this league with Scott Linehan as his mentor. And Scott Linehan, for those who don't remember, was both a head coach and an offensive coordinator. And he featured a lot more of what we call 11 personnel, Buck, meaning 3 wide receivers, 1 back, 1 tight end. So that's just another thought, another challenge for Todd Downing. What will this offense look like from a personnel standpoint?
And he's been very vocal about that. He's said to us every time that we've talked to him in media availability that this is not the Todd Downing offense. This is the Tennessee Titans offense, and Todd Downing is the man tasked with making all the pieces work. But going back to that system quarterback conversation, Greg, before we move on to the rest of the division, and I know we're focusing a lot on the offense, but that's what brings the sex appeal for.
Hey, they averaged over 30 points a game last year, you know.
And to see them have any chance of sustaining it would be unthinkable as far as I was concerned before Julio Jones came into the picture. It certainly gives them a much better chance. But does game game manager also carry that same kind of stigma that NFL people don't think of game manager as a bad term to assign a quarterback to, because that is something that also Tannehill gets labeled with. And from as far as I'm concerned, I'm wondering how you see it and how people in NFL circles see it.
Well, if you want honesty, these are pointless designations, because if you talk to coaches, they want their quarterback to be a system quarterback and they want their quarterback to be a game manager.
Right.
So these are wonderful discussions for sports talk radio and other formats, but they really don't have any meaning whatsoever to coaches.
This is exactly why we're doing the podcast. We're just out here trying to not educate. Well, we're trying to educate the people, but there's no constitutional law with the football terminology as far as we're concerned. In the rest of the division, as we move on and look at the way that the AFC South is kind of shaped up around the Tennessee Titans, I mean, the impact of Carson Wentz, Greg, with the Indianapolis Colts, I understand the connection to Frank Reich, and I understand what Carson Wentz has been previously in his career. But I struggle to believe that somebody who was as inaccurate, and I mean, I've never, especially in a clean pocket last year, Greg, this man looked to be fundamentally broken with the Philadelphia Eagles, and things didn't go right in Philly last year. It's not all Carson Wentz's fault, but after watching broken Marcus Mariota with the way that things started to devolve here, when I watch the Colts or when I watch the Eagles on film, I get a little bit of that vibe, injuries notwithstanding. What impact does Carson Wentz have on this division?
Well, Carson Wentz was broken last year. I think he was broken physically, and I think he was broken a bit mentally. And it was very surprising because most would have said after the 2017 season that he was on his way to being a top 3 or 4 quarterback in this league. Wentz is an interesting player. You almost have to go back to North Dakota State when he played in college, because I remember watching his tape and I loved him coming out. I thought he was the best quarterback prospect in that draft. As many might recall, Goff went number 1 and Wentz number 2. But Wentz did a lot of work in college pre-snap at the line of scrimmage. He was very much a pre-snap quarterback. And keep in mind, his first 2 years in the league, they had Frank Reich as the offensive coordinator and John DeFilippo as the quarterback coach, both veteran NFL coaches who really understood the quarterback and the quarterback position. Both had worked with Philip Rivers in San Diego. Then they both left. And then they had younger coaches, inexperienced coaches working with Wentz. And my sense is that Wentz is very much a quarterback that wants control pre-snap. He wants to control the game. I think he's capable of that. I don't know if that was the Doug Peterson approach. Just my sense from watching the film. Obviously I'm not there in their meetings and in their film room discussions, but my sense is there was a bit of push and pull between Doug's approach, which I don't want to say it's rigid. That would be the wrong word. But, hey, here's the play. Here's what we run. And Carson Wentz's approach, which is, hey, let me see here's how I see the game, and let me play the game. And we'll see what happens in Indianapolis, because clearly he was broken last year in many ways.
I could not – with the way that the Colts are continually favored, and maybe that's just a product of living here in Tennessee and covering the Tennessee Titans and not really understanding why the Colts are looked at as the team that should be the favorite in the division, and not to get into gambling odds and things like that on this podcast. But with the kind of offense that Frank Reich has run, from Andrew Luck with the brief time that they spent together to Jacoby Brissett, and then last year Philip Rivers, largely predicated off a power run game, is what ails Carson Wentz fixable through the scheme and through the new coaching that he will now have, even if the coaching isn't necessarily new to him?
Well, of course, that's an unanswerable, but they do have weapons. They have a very good O-line. They've got good weapons on the perimeter. I've been through this summer. I went through all of T.Y. Hilton's past targets. I went through all of Michael Pittman's past targets. I think Pittman is an ascending player. I thought Hilton still looked like he had excellent route quickness and excellent separation quickness. He still got vertical at times. They're waiting for Paris Campbell, who's was a draft pick in 2019, who's been injured his first 2 years, to really become a factor. He's a big physical wideout who can run. They've got tight ends. Jonathan Taylor, over the last 7-8 games, clearly became the foundation back they anticipated when they drafted him in the second round out of Wisconsin. So this is a team that has weapons and the ability to play in different ways, Buck. They can be a power running team. They can throw the football. They can play they can take multiple approaches depending on how they see a particular opponent. Obviously, we know it comes down to Wentz. That's not a profound statement, but the pieces are in place.
On the other side of the ball for Indianapolis, I understand what DeForest Buckner is and one of the best interior defensive linemen in football, but I could not help noticing, and I'm certain that this was not just noticed by me, but by anybody who understands what's happening on a defensive front, I could not help notice how much of a difference Danico Autry made that allowed DeForest Buckner to play off him. Obviously, now Danico Autry comes to Tennessee. Jeff Simmons is regarded as a very talented young defensive lineman, somebody who has a high ceiling that I think we still have yet to see. Is he was the most double-teamed defensive lineman in football last year. What consequence do we think Danico Autry leaving the Colts and coming to the Titans will have for an Indianapolis front that was super stout in 2020?
Yeah, and Autry is a good player. I thought the signing by Tennessee was a very good one, and my guess is he'll be used in a similar way. Now, in Indianapolis, the way Autry was used was he lined up at defensive end in the base defense and moved inside in the sub-package defense, and they were predominantly a nickel defense, 5 DBs. I believe they probably drafted Kwity Paye to ideally fill that role. He was their first round pick. So he would play defensive end in the Colts base defense and then likely move inside. I would think, maybe not. It depends on what they feel in terms of other edge rushers. Like I think Kamiko Toure, who they drafted in 2018 out of Rutgers and who's been injured, I think he's got excellent edge rush traits. So if he can stay healthy and stay on the field, I would see Kwity Paye moving inside and Kamiko Toure being the other edge rusher. But we'll see. What they do have is they do have excellent athleticism and speed at linebacker, particularly in their nickel, with Darius Leonard, one of the best 3-down linebackers of the game, and Bobby Okereke, who's a really athletic player. The secondary does have some questions, though, Buck. Xavier Rhodes is getting older. And Rock Ya-Sin, who they really want to be the corner opposite Rhodes, struggled a bit last year.
Pretty disappointing.
In fact, it was benched at times for TJ Carey, who's still there. But Rock Ya-Sin needs to, and I hate cliches, but I for the purpose of this, I'll say it. He needs to, quote unquote, step up. So their corner position is a little bit, to me, I don't want to say a concern, but let's say a bit of a work in progress.
It's cool, Greg. I said game manager and system quarterback.
Yeah.
So as far as cliches go, it's I've already committed an error in our first episode of the podcast. But we certainly. There should be an expectation for Indianapolis to step up, especially on that defensive side of the ball, which was where their bread and butter was in 2020. It was an incredibly fierce front, and that the Titans were able to take advantage of really in that road game at Indianapolis solely because DeForest Buckner and Danico Autry were out due to COVID concerns. In Jacksonville, obviously the first overall pick, Trevor Lawrence and Urban Meyer are the headliners here, but I wonder, Greg, with what we know of Jacksonville's roster on the offensive side of the ball, it will be difficult for them to improve substantially. I mean, to go from 1 game to maybe 6 or 7 games would be substantial improvement for the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's a lot of burden that Trevor Lawrence is going to have to shoulder. But they have very interesting, from my standpoint, they have very interesting skill position players in Jacksonville. A lot of versatility to those guys. And I think that he is being dropped into an offense. We'll see how Urban wants to run things. But he's being dropped into an offense that I think has I don't want to call it a high ceiling, because again, they still have a tough road to go down to try and make a dent in this division, given what the Colts and the Titans are right now. But what do you think, understanding what the skill set of Trevor Lawrence is, what do you look at this offense and say, okay, this will be the best utilization of this quarterback with the skill position players that they currently have on the roster?
Let me turn this around, because there have been studies done that show, and these are the the analytic studies that are done,
Sure,
that show that rookie quarterbacks, no matter where they're drafted, have success based on the quality of the team around them. And again, without, I'm sure there's lengthy spreadsheets done about this kind of stuff, Buck. I don't have all that right in front of me, obviously, but Trevor Lawrence is in an interesting situation because this is not a very good defense, and it wasn't last year, and we don't know what it'll be this year. They've made some changes. They probably feel pretty good about their corners, getting Shaq Griffin from Seattle in free agency, CJ Henderson, a high pick going into his second year. They probably feel they're improved. But if Trevor Lawrence is forced by choice to throw the ball 35, 40 times a game, studies show that is a recipe for disaster for a rookie quarterback. So we can sit here and talk about their weapons, and they have weapons, no question. They signed Marvin Jones. They drafted Travis Etienne, who's incredibly explosive. They still have Chark. They still have Chenault. It's an offensive line that has been together, hasn't quite gelled yet, but has been together. So, we're not certain here, because this defense could be the deciding factor.
right.
When your quarterback has to drop back 35, 40 times a game, number one, he's not mentally ready to do that in the NFL, no matter how smart he may be, and he's going to get hit more. And those hits accumulate, Buck, and they're problematic.
Oh, they can. I mean, I say this all the time, certainly on the radio show, that far more quarterbacks have been ruined than have been developed for exactly reasons like that. I guess, to kind of look at a different situation from a season ago, Greg, in terms of wins and losses, the wins were not there for the Los Angeles Chargers, but Justin Herbert was able to flourish in a way that, probably due to a great amount of talent that he's had. I really didn't see that many, and I'm blanking on the name of the former NFL executive who is now on ESPN, in fact, drafted Ryan Tannehill, Mike Tannenbaum, who was one of the loudest voices in support of Justin Herbert coming out of that year's draft class. What was there something that stood out about the position that the Chargers put Justin Herbert in that you would say, okay, they did this well to allow a rookie quarterback to succeed, even again, as the wins did not add up the way that they wanted? It's
a great question. And Herbert is extremely talented. I would argue he's more talented than Trevor Lawrence, but others might disagree. And he did not play behind a great O-line. There were stretches during the season where he did not have his top receivers, no question, but he was successful. And now he's, as I said, I think he's got some traits that are better than Trevor Lawrence's that helped him in these situations. He's Lawrence has mobility, but I would say Herbert's a better athlete. So, obviously there's always exceptions, but history shows that a defining factor in the success of rookie quarterbacks is the team. And we'll see what Jacksonville is. Their defense was bad a year ago, and they've tried to improve it. They're counting also on the success of some younger players who they hope continue to improve. We'll find out.
From a schematic standpoint, from what we know about Urban Meyer and the time that he spent in the college ranks, and what he believes in on principle with what he wants his football teams to look like, is there a way, and understanding that he's not coordinating this time around in Jacksonville, that he will rely on his coaching staff as well and the people that he's put around him to help him succeed at this level. But what do you look for in Urban Meyer to translate maybe from what he has done historically that's made him a successful football coach to bring to the pros?
That's a great question. I really can't answer that, other than I think, given who he brought in as offensive coaches with Darrell Bevell and Brian Schottenheimer, and the fact that they drafted Etienne and they have James Robinson coming off a 1,000-yard season, I think they're going to try to run the ball. I think despite Trevor Lawrence, okay, and I think this would be the smart move, I think they're going to try to play somewhat conservatively on offense. In other words, take their shots, be selective, but feature a run game, try to control the pace and tempo of games so they can limit the number of snaps their defense plays. What that does is it shortens games, okay? When you try to run it, it shortens games. Now, you need to be somewhat successful, but I think you'll see their creativity show up more in the run game, Buck, than in the pass game.
That would make all the sense in the world to me. And by the way, Greg, it's not a good question if I don't get a good answer out of it. So I appreciate your flattery that way. But that's
well, everybody just thinks that it's the pass game where you're creative and do cool things. You can do that in the run game as well, and it would not surprise me to see them do that.
Well, I'm shocked that people still have that preconceived notion, given what the Baltimore Ravens have been able to do with their run game. Are we at a point where we will stop disrespecting running the football and the creativity that can be found in a run game, where you see teams like the 49ers and the Baltimore Ravens, understanding that the personnel is different? The Tennessee Titans are also a bit of a throwback in that regard, even though their offense was prolific both in run and the pass last year. Are we seeing that notion that this is strictly a passing league start to precipitate a little bit, understanding what teams are having success with the run?
Well, I think that, let's answer that this way. I think what teams try to do on offense is find ways to create explosive plays. You need chunk plays. Yeah. You're not going to score consistently getting 5-6 yards. Okay. You need chunk plays. On the flip side, what are defenses trying to do? They're trying to prevent explosive plays. But let's go back to offense, Buck. There's many ways to get explosive plays. It's like in boxing. Do you want to knock out your opponent? Yes, but that doesn't mean you just come out starting in round one and just flail your arms and hope you hit the guy in the jaw. In football on offense, it's not just, hey, let's just drop back and throw it 30 yards down the field on every play. There's ways to create explosive plays. The Titans have been very good at that since Ryan Tannehill became the quarterback, using their run game to create explosives. And by the way, you can create explosives without throwing the ball 30 yards in the air. How many times have we seen off the run game hitting A.J. Brown on a quick slant or a glance route, and because he has room to run, he makes it a big play.
Yards after contact.
Yards after catch, yards after contact. And Brown is as good as there is in the league in that particular category. Yeah. There's ways to do it. Look, they could put James Robinson and Travis Etienne on the field at the same time. Etienne is a movement player. He's super explosive. There's ways to try to create explosive plays. But this team cannot ask Trevor Lawrence to drop back 40 times by choice. That would be, in my view, a mistake.
The final team in this division, the lowly Houston Texans at this point, given everything that they are currently working through, a team that will probably look to run the ball quite a bit as well, with all of the running backs that they seem to accumulate throughout the course of the offseason. Nick Caserio is doing, I think, the best job that he can under the circumstances, and not knowing necessarily, or maybe they do know who's going to play quarterback for them in week one, and just not being Deshaun Watson, understanding the legal situation that he's still working through. David Culley is in a hugely unenviable position, Greg. Yeah. And I don't know how to evaluate this team with the, Frankenstein's monster of parts that they've tried to piece this thing back together.
Well, I think let's assume it's Tyrod Taylor. If it's not Deshaun, so for the purposes of our discussion today, Buck, let's assume it's Tyrod Taylor.
Yeah.
He's not Lamar Jackson, but I think you would see a lot of similar principles. Okay, don't forget, they now have Mark Ingram, who was in Baltimore and understands a lot of those principles. They have David Johnson. They've got Philip Lindsay. They've got Rex Burkhead. They've got a lot of backs who can do different things. So, I don't want people to think that I'm saying that, it's the same offense. It's Lamar Jackson. Boy, Tyrod Taylor, he's great. No, the point is not that. The point is the philosophy and structure of the offense. And I think you would see some of the same principles. Now, again, they're a team that will really want to try to control the football as much as they can. because defensively, they've got some question marks. So this is not a team that wants their defense on the field for a lot of snaps because, as I said, they still got some good players. They've got some young players who I think they feel good about, like Charles Omenihu, Ross Blaylock, a second-round pick a year ago. I think that other than Bradley Roby, the corner position is a little bit of a question mark. So, they've got some questions. So defense is a definite concern. And, look, there are going to be games. It's just the way it is, where they're down 14-0, 17-0, and it's going to be real tough for them to compete. But they're going to have a specific approach, a specific plan, and they hope they can compete with that plan.
No, and it's an excellent point made by you because I say I say tongue in cheek. Well, that's like you told a good question and then be like, but I can't answer your question, even though it was a good question. I think people get caught up in, the Houston Texans are in a bad spot. And I say tongue in cheek, they're signing every running back under the sun. But I think people forget the philosophical aspect of this, understanding the players that they're bringing in. And Nick Caserio has built winning teams, understanding that they were in New England and understanding who the head coach was and who the quarterback was during the bulk of Nick Caserio's time there. But there is a clear approach that I think people that you've rightly pointed out, people are missing the point on with how they are bringing these players in to try and change what it is that they do offensively that will best suit the skill set of these guys.
Yeah, I think you could see, when I talked about the same structure as as Baltimore, I think you're going to see multiple backs. You'll see multiple tight ends. They've got a lot of tight ends. They drafted one in the 5th round in Brevin Jordan, who I normally don't speak about this, but I'm just going by what I was told, whose talent is far better than a 5th round pick, but apparently he didn't present well through the draft process, and that's why he dropped to the 5th round. That's what I was told, but he's very talented. So you could see a team just like Baltimore that plays with 2 backs, 2 tight ends. I think that's what you're going to see. Just like we spoke about Trevor Lawrence, they don't want him in Jacksonville dropping back 40 times. I would think in an ideal world, and by the way, I'm not comparing Tyrod Taylor and Trevor Lawrence in terms of ability, but I would think Houston would not want Tyrod Taylor to drop back in a drop back pass game. I think you'll see a lot of play action, boot action out of base personnel. Don't forget, when you play with base personnel on offense, the defense gives you base personnel the large percentage of the time. And base personnel on defense is where you get your more predictable front looks and your more predictable coverage looks. So as an offense, you know what you're going against. So I think that's the way they're going to try to be. Look, Tyrod Taylor has had some success in this league. He's lined up as a starting quarterback and played 16 games a couple of times. So It's not as if they're playing with a quarterback that's never been out there.
Yeah, without question. That is our AFC South preview here on the first episode of the install. It may be National Nude Day, as Greg pointed out to me before the podcast started. But Greg, we made it through the first show, and I managed to keep all my clothes on. Out of respect, I had to.
Well, that you know what? I assume that's a good thing, Buck. I don't want to find out one way or the other, but I assume that's a good thing.
For the sake of you and for the sake of the audience who is going to be hanging out with us throughout the course of the football season and on this podcast, I think it is in everybody's best interest. But I really appreciate that you taking some time every week to be able to do this for the audience and help us understand more of what we're watching on Sundays. I'm really excited about this project that we're going to get to do together. And I look forward to getting into some more of the contenders before we ramp up to training camp in the next few weeks.
All right. I'm looking forward to it, Buck. This was a fun one.
No doubt.